Beginning overseas this morning, where several top Trump administration officials are preparing to meet with Russian leaders in Saudi Arabia to begin talks about ending the war in Ukraine. But Ukrainian President Zelensky insists his country will never accept a peace deal struck by the U.S. and Russia if Ukraine doesn't have a seat at that negotiating table. Zelensky made the comments to NBC's Kristen Welker during an exclusive Newsy interview on Meet the Press that aired yesterday.
Can you accept any peace deal that is cut without Ukraine?
No. I'm sure that we have to be there, otherwise it's not acceptable. But if there is a decision without us and Putin will go out from all our land, we will be in NATO and Putin will be in the prison, so President Trump can do it without us.
Zelensky laying out the stakes there. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Marco Rubio arrived in Saudi Arabia earlier today to initiate negotiations toward peace. Zelensky indicated that Ukraine had not been invited to that. Zelensky spoke to NBC News amid a high-stakes security gathering in Munich, Germany over the weekend. While there, he also met with Vice President J.D. Vance.
You had a message to Vice President Vance about the potential implications of pulling out of NATO. What was your message to the Vice President?
That will be destroying of NATO.
President Zelensky also shared details about what he said to President Trump during a phone call between the two last week.
Is it true that you told President Trump during that phone call that Putin is only pretending to want peace because he is afraid of Mr. Trump?
Yes. Yes, I said that he's a liar. And he said, I think that my feeling, he said, that he's ready for peace negotiations. And I said to him, no, he's a liar. He doesn't want any peace. But I think he's really a little bit scared about the President Trump, and I think the president has this chance and he's strong, and I think that really he can push Putin to peace negotiations. Yes, I think so. I think so he can, but don't trust him, don't trust Putin.
At the security conference, Zelensky said he has intelligence that Russian President Vladimir Putin is amassing more troops on the Belarus border to potentially invade other NATO countries. Additionally, Zelensky called for the creation of a European army to deter Russia.
Let's be honest, now we can't rule out the possibility that America might say no to Europe on issues that threaten it. We must build the armed forces of Europe so that Europe's future depends only on Europeans.
Joining us now, national security correspondent for The Wall Street Journal, Nancy Youssef. Nancy, thanks for joining us. There was much made of what Zelensky's reaction would be to all of the news regarding his country, as well as the U.S. and Russia over the course of the last week. We got it there. What stuck out to you?
Well, a couple things. He was adamant that there could be no negotiation without including Ukraine. And he was so forceful in his interview with Meet the Press. The other interesting point to me is that he really started to outline an alternative where the United States wasn't the leader in European defense, that he was sort of among the leading European leaders to say maybe we can't count on the United States and have to think about alternative things, armies even, because the U.S. is not the reliable partner that I think Ukraine saw just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I do think that that's a really key point. But then also just laying out so starkly, if we're not at the table, we're not going to go for this deal. And of course, as these pre-negotiations begin, they're not at the table.
Not only that, Zelensky just landed in the United Arab Emirates today, which has been a key negotiator between Kiev and Moscow when it comes to prisoner of war releases. And the fact that he's starting to look at potentially alternative partners, alternative negotiations. The Europeans are meeting right now. The leadership is talking about having meetings throughout the week to potentially provide its own alternative negotiation proposal. We basically have potentially dueling options for ending the war being negotiated by Europe and Ukraine on one side with other partners and the United States and Russia on the other, going on in real time this week.
But I wonder then where that lands, a negotiation that's already going to be so fraught, so tenuous. If Ukraine has an option that doesn't include the U.S. because they feel they're not the ally that they once were with the new Trump administration, that must make it much harder then, of course.
Well, it's interesting because what is that? Whose negotiation sort of supersedes the other?
Exactly.
And I think what's interesting too is, Trump has a very fast timeline. I'm not convinced that Putin does as well. And so even as we talk about sort of Russia and the United States in direct talks, it's not clear as of yet that they have the same outcome in mind and the same timeline to reach that outcome.
I think that's a really important point as we move forward on this story. I then also want to keep us on the world stage, but pivot to yet another conflict, because as the Israel-Hamas war enters its 500th day, that fragile ceasefire brokered by the Biden administration is still holding. Hamas released 3 hostages over the weekend in exchange for 300 Palestinian prisoners and detainees. It's the 6th swap to occur under that ceasefire deal. The 3 hostages, which include an American-Israeli dual citizen, were forced to give a speech on a stage with a backdrop of Hamas leaders. It all comes as Secretary of State Marco Rubio was in Israel over the weekend. He met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday, as well as the Israeli opposition leader. So, Nancy, we see that this ceasefire was on shaky ground even when it was announced. We've seen multiple bumps in the road, especially as Trump has come forward with this very out of the box, so far out of the box that we're in another country kind of idea of redeveloping Gaza. Where does it go from here? Do you think they actually make it to the next phase?
Well, it's interesting because the Riviera, the Middle East plan really almost overshadowed talks about reaching phase 2, which would involve the release of more hostages and Israeli troops eventually leaving Gaza. And instead, during his time in Israel, we heard Rubio and Netanyahu talking about this plan, Rubio defending it to the Middle East. It's another area where we're seeing the region sort of adjust to a different U.S. presence. We've seen Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE try to put forward alternative plans where technocrats would run Gaza. And again, it's trying to adjust to this new paradigm where the U.S. isn't in the same position that it was. Rubio's just landed in Saudi Arabia, again, as part of these talks. But can they happen when we have sort of dueling visions of what the next few weeks could look like?
Dueling visions, and now Netanyahu's original vision emboldened in many ways by Trump and his actions, right?
Right. And, this is, I think, one of the dangers of these plans is what we've seen from both sides, both in the extreme right in Israel and the extremists in Hamas, is that I think some are taking from the plan from the Trump administration is that if you're Hamas, you say maybe we shouldn't enter talks because it just leads to them eventually giving away our territory. And from the extreme right, maybe we should keep fighting because it's creating an opportunity for us to sort of have a vision of Gaza that wasn't on the table just a few months ago.
You talk about the open question around phase 2. What would it look like if the ceasefire deal were to get there?
Ultimately, it would take this from being a temporary peace to a potential permanent pathway to ending the war. And so that's why it becomes so important. We're, as you mentioned, we're in this very tenuous period. Right now, there's no guarantee, I think anyone believes, and that this war truly ends. We had Netanyahu talking about the return of hell to the region if things didn't go the way that he thinks it should in terms
very
of
Trumpian language there, yeah.
And so this week is critical to sort of seeing, are we on a pathway to potentially a permanent end, or do we live in this tenuous state where disruptions, disagreements about the state of the ceasefire opens the door for the return of hostilities?
It's certainly one of the situations that we'll be keeping an eye on. And for Secretary of State Marco Rubio, my goodness, I hope you packed your caffeine because it's a busy one. The Wall Street Journal's Nancy Youssef. Thank you.
Put a pin in that because I want to ask about the legal barriers that usually surrounds that information. Danny, I'm going to get that from you in a moment. But first, Jacob, I want to ask you a little bit more about your reporting on this. Who normally has access to this system?
That's a great question. And I actually want to revisit something that Aaron just mentioned, which is about security clearance. That's a complete red herring from the White House. Security clearance is an irrelevant credential to access this information. What we're talking about here is need to have information for tax administration. Is this going to help somebody serve a taxpayer or a business or a nonprofit that interacts with the IRS? Is it going to help them maintain these systems? Like from an IT perspective, contractors frequently have access to this data. But again, it's on a need to know basis. The IRS commissioner does not have access to the system. The National Taxpayer Advocate, who is the internal consumer watchdog at IRS, does not have access to the system. Political appointees at the Treasury Department do not have access to the system. I mean, this is something that's in place for bureaucrats and for people who interact with taxpayers so they can serve taxpayers as they have questions for the IRS. This is
Jacob,
not.
That's a really good point. Why don't they have that? Why are they not normally allowed that access? Why would you keep the head of the IRS or any of the political appointees of the IRS away from that information?
They are not interacting face to face or over the phone with a taxpayer. That's what this system is for. This system is when I call the IRS because I have a question about my taxes, whoever's on the other side of the line pulls it up and can see my log of information, my bank information, for example. If I get a direct deposit from my refund, my previous payments year over year, or my previous balances or refunds, the business that I work for, the business that I run, all of these things that I'm sending to the IRS. So they have information about me, so they have my financial data, so I can do my taxes. A political appointee does not need that information. High-ranking officials don't need that information.
Are they worried that politics is going to get into this? That someone with a political
absolutely Katie,
that
yes.
They're going to be targeting folks within this system?
Yes, I mean that is concern that I had heard overnight from numerous people in and around IRS. The president in his first term. And Ashley reported on this when she was with us at the Washington Post, and we miss you, Ashley, reported about President Trump in the Oval Office musing to people about why can't we use the IRS to go after folks. Elon Musk has been tweeting about doing this day over day. That is an acute concern, the primary concern, that if this information got into the wrong hands of political appointees, it would be leveraged against Donald Trump's enemies.
Ashley, tell us more about that. You've done so much reporting on Donald Trump's motivations, the revenge that he desires. How might he want to use the IRS, and who might he want to target?
Well, first, as Jacob mentioned, and it's a great scoop by Jacob in the Washington Post, my former home, Donald Trump has mused in previous iterations in his first term about weaponizing all manner of government agencies, but including specifically the IRS. Katie, as you and I know, he talked to his former chief of staff, John Kelly, about using the IRS to go after his political enemies. And then it was reported later, and there was no way to definitively prove that this was just not the random unluck of the draw, as it were, but that the IRS did this incredibly sort of deep dive, kind of known as a dead man's audit of James Comey and Andrew McCabe, both of them who were very clearly Donald Trump's enemies, who Donald Trump had expressed a desire to go after. They both get chosen allegedly at random for this incredibly invasive audit. The odds of that happening are sort of astronomically slim. And another reason, there's so many reasons why this is so alarming to so many people. But another reason, of course, is you have had Elon Musk standing in the Oval Office and musing, hey, we're looking at lawmakers who seem to be living too lavish of a lifestyle, right? Which is something that if the situation were reversed and Democrats were saying, you know, you have a public salary, but your house seems awfully nice. You know, are you just a good investor in the stock market, or are you performing fraud? Would be instantly denounced on privacy grounds, on anti-capitalist grounds from libertarians, from Republicans. So you have DOJ saying quite overtly, we want to look into people who we believe might have more money than we have arbitrarily decided they deserve. That's alarming. And you have a DOJ that is serving a president who has made quite clear and has begun to do so that he would like to use every power of his presidency to go after his political enemies in a manner of public retribution. This latest reporting from the Post is deeply alarming.
I know it's a holiday, Ashley, but has there been any expression of alarm or distaste even from any lawmakers that don't have a D in front of their name?
So to be fair, holiday, I have not done a full survey of all Republican lawmakers, but what we've seen in these first few weeks is that there is very little willingness to push back on Donald Trump, and not just push back, but sort of that lawmakers, especially Republicans, are in fact far from pushing back. They're actually abdicating the powers with which they are vested, the powers, for instance, of the purse strings, the powers of appropriation. And in some of these federal funding freezes, what you are seeing even then, when what Donald Trump is doing is negatively affecting a senator's state or a lawmaker's district, they're still not pushing back on the president. They're saying, I still absolutely agree with what he's doing, but hey, by the way, can NIH in my state keep its funding?
Danny, is it legal to target somebody at the IRS, with the IRS?
Well, the way it normally works is the IRS uses algorithms and computers to first flag someone, and then from there the human factor comes in, and they review the records to make sure whether or not an audit is required. In theory, one person acting alone cannot single-handedly direct an audit.
They can't just like Google somebody's name within the system or just search someone's name within the system and say, I wonder what Danny Savalos has in his bank accounts. I wonder what Danny Savalos sent last year to the IRS.
Right.
Not to target you specifically with this, but searching out a name.
But no, exactly right. I mean, the system is designed so that computer algorithms together with human accountability prevent the situation, in theory, that you're describing. But since so much of what the IRS does is shielded, especially the investigatory part of it, since so much of that is something that isn't really public, it leaves us wondering what exactly goes into it. And could a directive from the White House possibly influence that decision? It shouldn't, but who's to say it won't?
But if, say, you are finding yourself under an audit, surprisingly, or your information, someone screen grabs it, your information gets exposed, your home address or your savings account information or your salary or whatever, what is the recourse for that person? Does an American citizen have a recourse against the federal government?
Yeah, well, Jacob described a lot of the legal aspect very well. And basically, not even everyone within the IRS has access to the IDRS system, this sensitive information. And it's a violation of federal law to even browse it or access it without that permission. That could, in theory, go for a tax commissioner who, as Jacob pointed out, does not automatically have access to this sensitive information. So federal law protects and outlaws accessing this information without authority. The question is, to what degree and how fast can members of DOJ or someone else that the White House appoints or gets in there be granted that authority, be one of the people that is ordinarily allowed to access this information?
It's entertainment for Trump. It's
he's the president of the United States.
Listen,
this is a statement from the president of the United States.
I have lived through this.
Yes, you have.
And in good times and bad times, the president enjoys taking a grenade out on a Saturday afternoon, throwing it on the floor, and watching everybody react. Now, could it be a distraction? Could it be a diversion? Could it be just pure entertainment? This is what the president
So
does.
he's not saying the president's
And there's
above the
no
law.
downside.
Hi, everybody. It's 5 o'clock in New York. If it's an emperor Republicans want this President's Day, maybe it's about time they just say that and drop any and all pretense, because Donald Trump sure has. Trump's first chief of staff there in his first term, Reince Priebus, dismissing what Jamal Bowie of the New York Times calls, quote, the single most un-American and anti-constitutional statement ever uttered by an American president. Trump this weekend posting a quote to social media often attributed to Napoleon. It reads, he who saves his country does not violate any law. Perhaps more alarming than that interpretation of presidential power and its unlimited scope is that the Supreme Court, in its ruling on presidential immunity last summer, has already sort of agreed with Napoleon and Trump. In her dissent in that case, provided with what she called a fear for our democracy, Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote this, quote, the relationship between the president and the people he served has shifted irrecoverably. In every use of presidential power, the president is now a king above the law. So it's with a keen eye that we'll be watching the Supreme Court this week as it begins the process of further clarifying what presidential power means in this country right now. In the very first case to reach the Supreme Court arising from Donald Trump's flurry of executive actions these past few weeks, the justices will again shape the scope of presidential power in a case having to do with who Trump can fire and who he cannot fire. But Trump's mantra that, quote, he who saves his country does not violate any law, end quote, isn't limited to presidents in his telling. If his supporters, for instance, believe that to be true, what stops them from doing whatever they want? Just ask the January 6 rioters who find themselves back in court for other offenses. According to the Wall Street Journal, many of them are right now arguing this, quote, that they should be absolved of other alleged crimes, such as illegal gun possession, child pornography, things discovered during the January 6 investigations. At least one defendant has died in a post-pardon altercation with police. And so that's the question now before all of us. Some people have taken to the streets about it. Some people are becoming more attuned to the news because they're unsettled by it. It's a question that'll be evaluated over the next days and weeks and years. Just how much power should Donald Trump really have? It's where we start the hour with some of our favorite experts and friends. The president of Media Matters for America, Angela Carasone, is back. We started this conversation in the last hour. Also joining us, former prosecutor for the Southern and Eastern Districts of New York, Barrett Berger, is back with us, and former assistant director for counterintelligence at the FBI, MSNBC national security analyst Frank Figliuzzi is here. Angela, let's pick up where we left off. People voted for Trump for a myriad of reasons, but not one of them in any of the exit polling data I saw or any of the brilliant analyses provided by Steve Kornacki or anyone else I consumed, even on Fox News, said that people were down with ending the full Democratic experiment and installing a king. Again, talk about what is exposed on Trump's flanks here.
Yeah, I mean, the big issue is that a lot of people voted for him for the vibes. Not as core supporters. They voted for something that they wanted. They voted for this type of destruction and revenge. That is the core. That is the base upon which he sort of, projected out this political power. But the way that he sort of got one, right, is he built political power on what used to be considered the fringes. So he brought in a bunch of these fringe figures, and now they're going to have to do a series of actions to be responsive to the people that they brought in. The scary part, as you noted in your intro, is that they started out with a really clear message and guidance, which is that we got your back. As long as you're doing things in line in support of Donald Trump, and in some way, shape, or form, you will not be held accountable for it. That's partly why those pardons are so uncomfortable and scary, is not just for the lack of justice, but for what they meant for the future. So that is sort of the context. The challenge here is that one of the strategies and the tactic is that all those people that didn't like it but voted for him anyway because they didn't really think these policies were real. And Reince Priebus in the intro he played is still a victim of this. They say, well, don't believe all the things he says, even though every time he says something, he goes ahead and sort of acts in accordance with it. Just trust your gut. Of course, that's absurd and ridiculous. He would never do such things. That's what a lot of people rationalize when they made this vote. But they were plain as day. This is not the first Trump time. The first Trump administration. This is the second. And that lack of popularity is both a source of strength and opportunity going forward for preserving our democratic structures. But it's a real weakness. It's a real vulnerability, because the reality is that by scaring everybody, by projecting this kind of power and that right now is not in fact there, it's still up for grabs. It's just trying to project a perception of it. We can choose to either validate it and make it so, or we can take the necessary actions to connect the dots to the harms, stiffen our spines, speak up, and speak to the very people that you identified that didn't really want this. They're, along with all of us, are going to be the source of our democratic resilience. And that's what this is about. This is about scaring everybody into submission. Heroes are heroes for a reason, because most people, when they're confronted, duck and cover. And what they're trying to do right now is not just shift the vibes, but to get all those people that held their nose or voted for Trump for a myriad of reasons, as you noted, to now be stuck. And that's we're at a critical juncture.
I mean, Frank, the most basic reading of a slide toward autocracy deploys despair and hopelessness. And one of the things about Reince Priebus that I thought, watching him talk, is he is known to have been one of the biggest leakers, calling Trump crazy, saying all sorts of things about his colleagues and about Donald Trump. And I jotted down, while he was talking, I jotted down a quick list of the things that people have said publicly about Donald Trump. He's a demonic force, said Tucker Carlson. He's America's Hitler, said J.D. Vance. He's a, quote, despicable human, said Mitch McConnell. January 6th was an act of, quote, domestic terrorism, said Ted Cruz. The people carrying out the enforcement of whatever Trump is saying are all hypocritical in that they've said worse things about Donald Trump than anyone in this program has ever said.
Yet we're watching Exhibit A for an unmitigated desire for power and influence and relevancy. That's who surrounds Donald Trump right now. People who literally can't get another job without kissing his rear end. And this Reince Priebus clip that you played, Nicole, nothing to see here, as Angela said. Don't worry, remain calm. He occasionally likes to take a grenade out and throw it on the floor to see what happens. I'll tell you what happens when you play with a live grenade and toss it on the floor. Eventually, it explodes. And the only question for us is whether it's going to explode back on Trump or explode and hurt the rest of us. And my money's on both, by the way. People are going to get hurt, and eventually it will blow back on Trump. And then, you know, with regard to this statement, which again, we shall not believe Reince Priebus when he says, don't worry, that someone who saves his country cannot violate a law. Okay, it's been attributed by some historians who aren't certain to Napoleon, but I'll tell you where it's definitely been used far more recently, and that's with a white supremacist, far-right extremist named Anders Breivik in Norway, who killed 77 people in Norway, the worst modern mass murder in Norwegian history, including a mass murder, 2 separate incidents by him on the same day, including a mass murder at a kids' camp in Norway. And he's the one who describes himself as a neo-Nazi who's used that statement more recently in history. And now our president is quoting that white supremacist neo-Nazi murderer. If you voted for that, you really need to question whether you're American anymore. But that's who's using that kind of statement. And listen, does Trump sit and read Norwegian history? Hell no. Someone is handing him this story, this quote, and we need to figure out who keeps spoon-feeding him the white supremacy, white terrorist philosophy.
You won't be surprised to hear, because you may be among them, it turns out the American people don't love watching Donald Trump and Elon Musk take an absolute wrecking ball to the federal government. I mean, today we saw massive protests right here in Washington, D.C., and also all across the country. You can see some of the photos on our screen. We saw protests in big cities and small towns and at state capitals. We saw just how pissed off people are about what's happening right now. And who could blame them? I mean, we just learned that Elon Musk's Doge crew is trying to get access to personal taxpayer data at the IRS. So basically, the world's richest man and his band of 20-something cronies want access to your personal data. They want access to your tax returns, your addresses, your employment information, your banking details, and your social security numbers. I mean, this is the kind of issue that hits home for all of us. I'm sure it hits home for you because most of us pay taxes, right? Just like most of us fly in on airplanes. And today, unbelievably, there was another major commercial airline incident. A Delta plane that took off from Minneapolis flipped over when it was attempting to land in Toronto. Nobody was killed, but at least 17 people were injured. And of course, it's just the latest in a series of air incidents since Trump was sworn in. And since an Army helicopter and an American Airlines plane collided right here in Washington, killing 67 people. Well, today, just 19 days after that tragedy, we are also getting new details about the Trump administration's purge of hundreds of critical air safety workers at the FAA. And I'm going to go into more detail also with somebody who knows a lot about it in just a moment. But the larger point is this. Donald Trump and Elon Musk are screwing around with government in all sorts of ways that impact you personally, and in ways that impact our national security and our safety more broadly. And in that process, they are teaching us a whole lot about all of the ways that government actually keeps us safe. For example, I mean, when the U.S. military needs to deploy more nuclear warheads on its planes and submarines to defend us, do you know who actually holds the components for those weapons? Who puts them together, makes sure they're safe, and delivers them to the Pentagon? Well, most of that work is actually done by the same people who also refurbish old nuclear weapons and dismantle the retired ones. And it all happens at one plant on the Sandy Plains outside of Amarillo, Texas, called the Pantex plant. It's where the employees and contractors for the Department of Energy are constantly inspecting and outfitting America's nuclear weapons with high explosives, as well as their cores of highly radioactive uranium and plutonium. All of this highly secretive, highly dangerous work is run by the Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration. They oversee the U.S. nuclear stockpile and its components, not just at Pantex, but at an entire network of plants, labs, and bases across the country. The NNSA does all of that and transports nuclear material on U.S. highways using a highly trained and heavily armed fleet of trucks and vehicles. And this is all overseen by career staff with very, very specific expertise. For some of them, decades of it. It's also the sort of government function that we don't think about all the time. I hope you don't think about all the time. But it's always working in the background. It has to work because you can't mess around with the people who handle our nuclear weapons. Well, I mean, at least you thought you can't.
The latest bit of information coming in from the National Nuclear Security Agency, which is tasked with overseeing and building the nation's nuclear weapons stockpile. Their notices have gone out with termination for probationary employees effective immediately.
That's right. So as part of its purge of government employees, Elon Musk and his merry band of young Doge axemen unilaterally fired 350 workers at the agency responsible for safeguarding nuclear arms components. And almost immediately, they realized they'd made a terrible mistake.
NBC News has obtained an email sent to employees of the National Nuclear Security Administration. It says in part the termination letters for some NNSA probationary employees are being rescinded, adding that officials do not have a good way to get in touch with those personnel.
Do not have a good way to get in touch. Okay, that's right. Under Elon Musk's eye, the Trump White House fired a chunk of the NNSA workforce, and one of the hardest hit offices was the Pantex plant that I was just talking about, near Amarillo, Texas. They saw about 30% of the cuts. You know, that's the plant where employees work on reassembling warheads, one of the most sensitive jobs across the nuclear weapons enterprise, with the highest levels of clearance. But now the geniuses who let those employees go can't figure out how to unfire the people it had just locked out of government buildings and email. You literally can't make it up sometimes. The director of the Arms Control Association told the AP, quote, "The Doge people are coming in with absolutely no knowledge of what these departments are responsible for." So yes, they are messing around with the people who literally handle our nuclear bombs. That's what Donald Trump and Elon Musk are doing. Now, at the same time, the Trump administration is firing hundreds of employees at the FAA, just weeks after the deadliest U.S. air disaster in decades. Those firings reportedly include personnel hired for FAA radar, landing and navigational aid maintenance, as well as a technician who was working on a critical cruise missile defense radar system. Now, as I mentioned, there's already been a spike in serious and fatal crashes since Trump took office, and since the FAA's chief resigned, in accordance with the demands of Elon Musk. And that list doesn't even include the latest. That Delta plane that crash landed and flipped on the runway in Toronto. That flight left from Minneapolis under FAA supervision, though it was being directed at the time of the crash by their Canadian counterparts. Even still, lots of Americans are understandably wondering, you may be too, if Trump's FAA is still able to keep air travel safe, just as more firings of critical air safety personnel are underway. So yes, people are pissed, and it is not hard to see why. And as we watch these protests play out across the country, we're also watching a metaphorical ticking time bomb in a country where we suddenly have to worry about the safety of our air travel and of our literal nuclear bombs. Starting us off tonight is David Spiro. He's the president of the Professional Aviation Safety Specialist Unit. David, thank you so much for taking the time here. I mentioned this, and I know you've probably been answering this question from friends and family as well. And people are understandably a little freaked out right now about air travel, and we're simultaneously seeing all of these layoffs, these firings that are happening under Donald Trump and Elon Musk, as well as what feels like an increase in incidents in the air. I just wonder how you make sense of what's happening, that all happening simultaneously.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's been a difficult few weeks, obviously, and our hearts go out to the passengers on the plane today, the crew, the first responders. Happily, at the moment, there's been no fatalities, so hopefully that stays the way it is. I think that it's important to note that the U.S. air traffic control system is safe, and our members are a key reason why that's the case. We work with integrity, we work with skill, and we have a deep background in how to maintain the air traffic control system and how to oversee it. But as you pointed out, just this past Friday, about 300 folks, 400 people got the axe on St. Valentine's Day, right? Out to dinner and enjoying a nice evening and find out they lost their job. We didn't get any notice from the FAA. At this point right now, we don't know if it's 300, 400, or 1,000 because...
So it could be, I just want to pause on that. It could be way more than the 350 that have been reported.
It could be. They haven't told us who it is. And as far as we're concerned, the inspectors and the technicians, we have probationary inspectors and technicians that could possibly have gotten the axe, but we don't know that for certain. All that we're getting right now is our members reaching out to us and telling us, hey, I lost my job. And we're talking about people that support the entire air traffic control system by virtue of the support work that they do. So let me start out and talk about aeronautical information specialists. They are a skilled group of people that create charts, navigational processes, a performance-based navigation where aircraft can fly in a lot more efficiently. It takes a long time to develop those skills. There's at least 30 of them that are probationary employees in the FAA that we represent. And quite honestly, if they're gone, who's going to create that product? And the work that our aviation safety assistants do for our inspectors to make sure that they can actually go out and ramp airplanes and check on pilots and airworthiness of aircraft. They do all of that stuff because they have these support groups behind them.
You mentioned some of the skills, and maybe those are the main ones for people to understand. But for people who are watching who aren't experts, for all of these layoffs, and it was already understaffed to begin with, what is the impact on airports and the ability to safely land planes? How should people understand that if these cuts continue?
Well, if these cuts continue, I don't know how far into the bone you can go before you have to start looking at let's look at navigational aids or radars or automation systems that air traffic controllers use, communications that they use to get the airplanes up in the air and down to their destination and people there safely. If we don't have the right people with the right skill sets working in these locations, or if they're off doing something else because they don't have that support group anymore, then quite honestly, we're going to have delays. There's always backup systems, but if I don't have the right person in the right place to be able to restore a system like happened in Chicago last year, where we didn't have anyone on duty that could intervene in the automation system, where they were having errors coming through and controllers couldn't tell what the planes were. So we had to stop. We had stops at 5 airports in the Chicago area. That sort of thing is because you don't have the right person in the right place. Now, if we're going to have to leave the work that we do and go off somewhere else to take care of work that someone else was doing for us to make sure that we can do our jobs, then that's going to make it even more difficult.